Hey guys, I want to welcome you to the weekly Wednesday for the Financial Freedom newsletter, where every week, every Wednesday, we delve into something inspirational, motivational, something excerpt taken from the Financial Freedom weekly newsletter. Wherever you are, if you're listening on Spotify, on iTunes, Google, be sure to click the like, subscribe, share, comment. And without ado, let's get into the show. Guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm really excited about today's guest, Jonathan Bednar. He's a CFP, he's an author, he's also a podcast host. And today he's going to be talking about his journey owning an investment firm, providing financial advice. We'll also talk about his book as well as his podcast, What the Wealth, which is quite interesting. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate this opportunity and look forward to spending some time with you today.
Yeah. We connected through Podmatch, and tell the audience, introduce yourself and what you do, and we'll get into it.
Absolutely. So my name is Jonathan Bednar. I'm a certified financial planner. I've been in the industry for 15 years. I co-own Paradigm Wealth Partners, which is based out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and then have this What the Wealth brand, which is kind of a way for me to just use my own authentic voice to communicate with people. I've published 2 books and host the podcast called What the Wealth. So, we spend a lot of our time helping people pursue financial freedom, retirement planning, all of those things. And having, the books and the podcast is really an outlet for me to do more teaching and less selling.
Yeah, I love that education. And so, talk about one thing is, you have like I said, financial planners, they're in the state of flux with the financial industry getting disrupted, and they have to reinvent themselves. I think eventually lawyers and doctors are going to have to do the same thing. So one thing is talking about is how do you distinguish yourself? When all the financial advice is there, how do you add value, make a distinction, stand out?
I think a lot of that's through just being authentically myself, and understanding that I will attract a certain tribe that want to work with me, and that's okay if I don't attract everybody. And giving not only potential clients perspective, but also and flexibility, but also giving myself that flexibility, which again kind of led me towards writing and authoring the podcast too, because I can only wrap my arms around so many people. But still, I want to be able to help kind of spread some news and the message of financial planning. So those other options gave me that ability. We specialize in helping career professionals. I believe everybody wants to retire at some point. That could be retire early. It could be work till you're 95. But usually people want to retire. I've yet to find someone that doesn't. But we spend a lot of time helping younger professionals, career professionals, sales executives, doctors, high earning professionals who really don't have the time and or the energy. It's not that they're not smart enough to do this. They're certainly capable of doing this on their own, but whether they're running their own practice or their own business or just spending time with their family, they don't want to do that. And so they've chosen to outsource it. And so, really that's where we spend time, the most.
It's it's quite interesting, the way everything is going toward. And so one thing is talking about, you mentioned, most people want to retire. And what's interesting is, I was talking to some other and reading, and like this idea of reaching a certain number and then basically not doing anything what is your thoughts on as a advisor? Basically, the idea is you reach a number and then basically you can, but people have to have purpose and passion. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with the whole FIRE concept. I think it's awesome in principle. I think in reality, as I talked about in my book and when I'm talking with people, we identify usually by our accomplishments. We're parents, we're students, we're police officers, we're teachers, we're advisors, we're doctors, we're a lot of times actually when we meet somebody, you know, I'm Jonathan, I'm a certified financial planner. I own Paradigm Wealth Partners. And that actually usually leads the identity more than I'm Jonathan, I'm a dad and a husband. And so I think a lot of that is because it gives us purpose, it gives us fulfillment. And even if the certain job now doesn't, you always have the flexibility to move to a new career path. I'm a big believer in having community around you, and you can do that in the fire journey and find other people that want to pursue fire and have friendship. But I believe that we were created to act as a community, to use our brains, to work, to live. And the reality is, if we all just pursue fire, none of us have a job. I mean, we need people to work to provide food and to provide healthcare services and to provide teaching and childcare. So we actually need people to do all these things. Do I think it's good to have work-life balance and pursue your passions and do those things? Of course, but I think there's actually a greater sense of purpose and fulfillment that you get by continuing to work. And I actually think it, causes you to live longer. There's less burnout. You can retire early and do all the things, and 2, 3, 4 years from now, you're kind of twiddling your thumbs. You've checked all the boxes. So I think one of the interesting things is Michael Kitces, a thought leader in the financial industry. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's talked about for career professionals, younger people, kind of doing these mini retirement. So you work for 5 years, you take kind of a year sabbatical. You work for 5 years, you take a year sabbatical. And I think that's a more interesting way to me to think about retirement for younger people, because I think it still gives you flexibility, but it still gives you, long-term purpose and fulfillment.
Yeah. And actually what's interesting is this fire movement and these, mini retirements like Tim Ferriss talked about. You're kind of the first person to actually talk about that, because most CFPs, and they're kind of this 20% or 10%, 20% savings, index fund, all this stuff. And then, like a 4% withdrawal rate. And that's kind of like the extent of their training. But this is kind of interesting. So when working with people, what is your number one mistake people make before retiring?
A lot of times the biggest mistake is not taking on enough risk. And I'm actually finding more and more of this, where younger career professionals they'll be saving and they'll be investing, but they're not investing enough. They'll, as an example, I'll say, are you maxing out your 401k? And they say, yes, I'm getting a 4% match and I'm putting in 4%. That doesn't mean you're maxing out your 4. And so that's just one example. Another example, again, is, someone may be an aggressive saver, but they save the money at the bank or they buy CDs even in younger years. And so I believe there's 5 big retirement risks, but 2 of them are longevity and healthcare. And with technology and healthcare getting better by the day, we live into our 90s. And actually there's studies today that say, Gen Z will live into their hundreds. I haven't started to see that yet, although I've had some clients live there, but not at the same kind of lifestyle that they're predicting, younger generations to be. So people need to take more risk. You need to be actively invested. You might think your investments are comfortable, but if you're early in your retirement journey and you're still working and you're going to retire, 20, 30 years down the road, you need to be much more aggressive than probably you think you should be.
Yeah. It's quite interesting because, with, I was talking, like most of the time I'm talking to entrepreneurs, and people in their 20s are more financially literate. They realize they have to start saving more and, avoiding consumer debt. And they were saying, with this inflation is now like 3%, and interest rates are like, 5%, maybe could be higher later. And S&P is like 8%. It's probably less than that given all this volatility. And then so basically, in NASDAQ is now 40% year up over the year. you talking about your aggressive, like people have to or start thinking, okay, forget the S&P because over a 10-year period and with all these like market drawdowns, if I get like 7%, 8% with inflation, and then I can put that money in a money market and get 5%, why would I put it in the S&P? So people are starting to think about this. They're starting to think about real estate. All these also these digital assets such as Bitcoin. I'm not, again, this is not advice, but people are starting to look into that because they want to get a better return and avoid, if the banks one day say, oh, your money's gone, we're going to be in like the banks in South America and all of that. So really interesting. So the other question is talking about this. So that's one thing. And then one thing is talking about what are the big 5 risks to retirement. That's quite interesting. Risks to retirement. What do you mean?
Yeah, this is from my second book, which is titled "What the Wealth: Identify Your Core Values, Reignite Your Dreams, and Combat the 5 Big Risks to Retirement," or the 5 big retirement risks. The 5 big risks are taxes, inflation, longevity, withdrawal strategy, which applies later on. If you're still a career professional, you're still working. The withdrawal doesn't impact you today, but it will at some point. And then probably the biggest risk of all is our behavior. Are you taking on enough risk? Are you too aggressive with not enough real strategy, just kind of willy-nilly? So those are the 5 big risks, and I think they're important. Again, whether you're 20 or 30 or you're 70 and 80, these risks are very real for everybody. Taxes back in the 40s were as high as 90%. The highest tax bracket today is 37. Incredibly high debt, $32 trillion in U.S. debt. And as the rates have risen over the past 12 months, we've seen the interest on that debt balloon. At one point, we had 45 workers for every Social Security recipient. Today, we have roughly 2.8 workers for every Social Security recipient, and that number is going down. There's a lot of risk that you need to be aware of. And if you're going to be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand, you may or may not make it. And that's where I think a financial plan can really help benefit a lot of people. Having an actual, not only investment plan, how are you going to invest and how are you going to make decisions, but what if, this event happens, or what happens, prematurely lost your job or have some sort of disability. Any of these other scenarios, how do you plan for that? And so that's where I think creating this financial plan around those 5 big risks really helps build out and strengthen that foundation.
Yeah. If 2020 wasn't a wake up call, it's like, everybody is SOL. It's on their own. You can't depend on Social Security before you could. Social Security is actually a Ponzi scheme. U.S. is broke. You can't depend on a job because, now everybody's freelancing and having multiple streams. And taxes are a waste of money. So it's quite, and then what's interesting is that, you talked about longevity, which is quite a really fascinating field. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs are looking into that, looking into like cloning themselves in artificial ease. And so that when they leave, there's going to be an AI version of them, or eventually it's kind of like the Matrix where we're plugged in. Kind of is like this virtual metaverse, which is sounds quite ridiculous, but it could happen.
30 years ago, I don't think people really would have thought there would be autonomous vehicles. And here we are today. They are very much real.
Yeah.
I think there's I just left an executive leadership symposium at UCLA about 60 days ago. And one of the professors there, Hal Hirschfield, was talking about, how we think about our future self and the limiting ability of really thinking essentially past the now. I mean, we can think some future, but the longer future goes, you might have a dream of retiring or owning a lake house or a beach house, whatever it is, but how you actually think about your future self is very, very difficult. And there's an interesting study. So yeah, it's kind of relates back to the stuff you just mentioned, or driverless vehicles, or just technology in general. It's pretty amazing, and it's only accelerating.
Yeah. The other question I have is, since you seem to be on the kind of the cutting edge of thought leadership in terms of the CFP landscape. There's whereas essentially, you know, with jobs going to be, let's say there's no quote job security anymore, and now there's this thing called universal basic income. So I don't know if what your thoughts on that. If clients are starting to talk about that, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my clients aren't really asking about that at this point. You know, I think as the people that say AI is a disruptor to every industry but their own, I think have some of their blinders on. I mean, I think AI can disrupt every industry, but I don't actually think it disrupts us to the point that our jobs go extinct. I kind of think back to the Industrial Revolution when tractors were really invented to help plow fields and make life easier. People thought, well, that's just going to kind of make us go extinct. The reality is it increased productivity. Back to what I was learning at that UCLA study, there was a conversation about, this is not the leading professor that kind of led the group, but another one talking about AI. And he was talking about the potential disruption for radiologists and having AI read these scans. And there were some statistics where if the doctor read the scan only and if the AI read the scan only, but actually the best result was if AI and the doctor collectively read the scans, actually had the highest outcome. And I think that's what you'll see more of. I think you'll see companies and professionals, you know, continue to evolve and use this AI. Sure, AI could probably cause some businesses to go extinct, but I think for the most part, most companies and industries will use it to their benefit and make outcomes better for even clients and users. As it relates to universal basic income, I think it's certainly a possibility. I think we've kind of seen that kind of with Social Security. Obviously, Social Security is at a higher, you know, age limit than universal basic income, which is being talked about at a lower level. There's obviously some politicians that have kind of pushed that narrative and started the conversation. I'm not saying it's not possible. It certainly is possible. I think it's still probably several years down the road, but probably potentially closer than it was prior to maybe the last year when AI really started to take hold. So I don't know if I'm qualified enough to really talk a lot about that. But it would not surprise me if it does happen at some level. How do we fund it would be the issue, because we're back to 2.8 workers for every Social Security recipient. The only way to fund, not the only way, but the major driver to shore up the Social Security shortfall is to raise taxes. Mm-hmm. You would have to raise taxes to fund universal basic income. So, I think there's a big possibility back to our debt to GDP is about 122% or so. The way to offset a lot of these problems is to raise taxes. And I think people are grossly unprepared for that.
Yeah, it's quite a wake up call. You know, there's so much, for example, with the US broke and they basically have to, this is why most currencies go to zero, is because, basically the debts get out of hand and they have to inflate and print the currency, goes to zero. Eventually there's a reset. This is why owning, real estate, gold, now people are considering, Bitcoin. These are kind of hedges against these types of events. It's quite interesting. So you mentioned you wrote a book as well. So, and you're also a podcast. So kind of tell people how they can find your work and reach out to you. You seem to be really on the cutting edge of these ideas.
So you can find me on LinkedIn at J Bednar II. That stands for two. I'm the second. So J Bednar II, or just type in Jonathan Bednar. Both my books, What the Wealth, a guide for financial clarity for professionals and families, as well as What the Wealth, identify your core values, reignite your dreams, and combat the 5 big retirement risks, are both on Amazon. So you can find those there. The podcast, What the Wealth, can be found anywhere. Listen to podcasts. Those are the main two places. My website is You type in "What the Wealth" into Google, you can probably find me.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that title. It's kind of like a play on words, and yeah. So for all the audience out there listening, Jonathan for coming onto the show, giving these kind of new ideas and trends, from a CFP standpoint, and all of his resources, especially his book, will be in the links in the show notes. I'm gonna check that out right after this, and follow him on our socials. He's on LinkedIn, YouTube, and all of those will be in the resources. So with that, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
Absolutely.
I hope you really enjoyed that wonderful, inspirational, motivational piece. Again, wherever you are listening, if you liked it, be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe. We're on everywhere: Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, Audible. And without much ado, be sure to thank this show's sponsors, and we'll see you next week.